And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today, Nancy Frey and John Almarode. Nancy Frey is Professor of Educational Leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Previously, Nancy was a teacher, academic coach, and central office resource coordinator in Florida. She's a credentialed special educator, reading specialist, and an administrator in California. She's a member of the International Literacy Association's Literacy Research Panel, and she's published widely on literacy, quality instruction, and assessment, with books that cover things such as The Artificial Intelligence Playbook, How Scaffolding Works, How Teams Work, The Vocabulary Playbook, and Onboarding Teachers. Thank you so much for being with us, Nancy. And now I'd like to introduce John Almarode. Dr. John Almarode is a best-selling author and an associate professor of education at James Madison University. He was awarded the inaugural Sarah Miller Luck Endowed Professorship in 2015 and received an Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia in 2021. Before his academic career, John started as a mathematics and science teacher in Augusta County, Virginia. As an author, John has written multiple educational books focusing on science and mathematics, and he has co-created a new framework for developing, implementing, and sustaining professional learning communities called PLC+. Dr. Almarode's work has been presented to the U.S. Congress, the Virginia Senate, and the U.S. Department of Education. One of his recent projects included developing the Distance Learning Playbook for college and university instruction in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Continuing his collaborative work with colleagues on what works best in teaching and learning, his books include How Tutoring Works, Visible Learning in Early Childhood, How Learning Works, How Scaffolding Works, How Feedback Works, and the Mathematics Playbook. Thanks so much for being with us today, John. And now I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate the warm welcome. And I love that we're all here today to be able to talk about visible learning and where is a good starting point for that visible learning. That's a question that we get a lot, John. I imagine that you hear this as much as anything. And I think that what kind of trips people up is the use of the word the, as if there is one and only one place to begin. I think all of us as humans, we often like to be able to have things happen in a linear sort of fashion, but that's actually not how visible learning works. It's not something that you do for a couple of years and then move on to something else. It really is about how it is that organizations change their thinking, shape their thinking around a couple of key ideas. And so John and I would offer that the real question is, what is your starting point? There are multiple ways to be able to enter into the whole universe of visible learning, to be sure. And for each organization, that entry point is going to be a different place. That starting point is going to vary. And it really is about thinking through what works for the organization, where are those places to begin, and where is it that you want to be able to shape your journey. Now, I realize that I may not have answered that question yet, but I hope that by the end of this time that you have some ideas about what your starting point might be. Now, if you have hung around with John or me or John Hattie or Doug Fisher or any of the other people that work on this particular project, then you are certainly familiar with the idea of success criteria. I know that I use success criteria in the classes that I teach. John, I know that you do as well. Success criteria are really useful for a couple of different reasons. The first is because it helps to kind of prime the pump about what it is that comes next. And our success criteria for you are that you'll be able to explain what 4 key messages are in visible learning. And further, that you can describe what those signature practices are that are associated with visible learning. So we'll pull apart key messages and signature practices, and that we'll be able to identify a potential starting point for that visible learning journey.
All right, Nancy, I think we need to throw something into the chat box real quick. This is always one of my favorite things to ask, because if you Google it, if you look it up, if you pick up a book and try to read it, it's hard sometimes to really figure out what is visible learning in a very succinct way. So let's give it a run. We still haven't, I don't have an answer yet that is succinct. So maybe somebody on here with us, the 136 folks with us, can tell us, what would you say if somebody asked you, what is visible learning? Let's take a shot at that in the chat box. What would you say in response to that question on the screen? Adam, thanks for getting us started. Thank you. Yep. Know where they're going and why. A way to show thinking. Thinking about impact. Common knowledge. Show how. Show thinking.
Show how we're learning. Reflecting on your own practices. Boy, Casey, I love that.
Critical thinking skills, show learning. Excellent. Factors, yep, that impact learning. Yep. Okay, Jennifer. Yep. So what Nancy and I would like to do is take all of those answers and put them in a pile and blend them together into what John has used as his mantra, John Hattie has used as his mantra from the very, very beginning, the 2009 publication of Visible Learning. It's when we see learning through the eyes of our students. In other words, making their learning visible so that we can see it from their perspective, not just ours. And then students start to see themselves as their own teachers. Now, there's a catch to this because we don't want to give the impression that students seeing themselves as their own teacher replaces the teacher in that classroom. So another way to think about this is that students drive their own learning. And Nancy and Doug and John have an outstanding playbook that talks about how to help students drive their own learning. And so they know what to do when they don't know what to do, and they're no longer in our classrooms. And so how does that show up? So visible learning is this idea that we want to take learning and teaching and make it visible, so visible that we can see our impact, we can work together alongside students and leverage the feedback from that information to decide where to go next. And so to geek it up a little bit, this started as a hobby. For those that don't know the whole visible learning story, I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but please understand that this is rooted in a body of research that comes from a large body of evidence about learning in multiple contexts, multiple settings. Let's try the emotion reactions on your Zoom. How many of you, by a show of hands, a smiley face, a heart somehow, you've seen a study that tells you a certain strategy, intervention, or approach is okay, but then by the end of the week, you see another study that says, actually, don't do that. The thumbs up. Yep. Couple of hearts. Thank you to the optimists. And so that creates a bit of a challenge. So how do you make sense of all of the evidence that's out there about teaching and learning? How do you make sense of all of this? And that's really what led to John Hattie's hobby, which now brings us to the conversation today. What do we do with this? How do we make this happen? And as you know, a meta-analysis is our go-to. The world of meta-analysis doesn't necessarily look at a single study. It looks at a collection of studies to get the overall. Nancy, I can't not respond to that comment. Yeah, it's one thing to have a hobby like reading, watching sports, traveling, or seeing Broadway shows. When your hobby is calculating effect sizes, I don't know what to really do with that. But nonetheless, we get to benefit from those sorts of hobbies. And so meta-analyses give us effect sizes. And just as a real quick analogy for thinking about this, effect sizes are the potential. They're the potential that a particular influence impacts student learning. But here's the catch. Now, lean in on this one because this is huge, right? Because effect sizes aren't guarantees, they're potentials. And that potential needs to get converted into true impact by us and how we set up the environment and the culture in our classroom. And so when it comes to getting started with visible learning, we've kind of just let the cat out of the bag, haven't we, Nancy? It is actually the culture, climate, and the environment in which that potential is planted. And so really tonight's conversation, this afternoon's conversation, this morning's conversation, depending on where you are on the globe, is really about seeds versus soil. Visible learning tells us where we might plant certain seeds, but the soil that those seeds are planted in determine the kind of growth that we're going to get in our own districts, our own schools, and our own classrooms. But there's even more because the visible learning database is very overwhelming. Lots of influences, lots of studies. And so, Nancy, I think we can break this down into a better, more concise way of describing the soil that increases the potential for accelerating growth.
And so here come those 4 key messages that really hold the center of what visible learning is, because already perhaps your thinking is changing. Visible learning isn't something that you do to students. Visible learning is about changing the thinking of students and changing the thinking of educators at the same time. It's bi-directional. It goes in both directions. And so those 4 key messages that hold everything together, first of all, climate first, learning second, achievement third. If you don't have the soil to be able to really cultivate the kind of learning that should be occurring at a school site, at a district, across a state or a province, then you're not going to get the kinds of effects that you're looking for. When we talk about climate first, we've got to prepare the soil so that children and adults thrive in there. It's fostering a learning community, making sure that there's classroom cohesion among students, but certainly a learning community for teachers and for school leaders as well. Developing those social, emotional, and academic skills, those learning enablers that make it possible for learning to occur, that make it possible for caring educators to be able to do their very best and finest work every day, and maintaining those high expectations for all students. So that's the first key message. The second one, students should drive their own learning. Educators work impossibly hard at being able to try to accomplish the kind of movement forward that we need for our students. But we need our students in this fight. If we are always thinking about teaching and learning as being something that we as the adult in the room or the adult in the school have to do, then it's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back because you're not using what it is that students bring to the game. So a key message here is that students need to drive their own learning. And guess what that means? That means that we have to be able to cultivate those self-driving learners, which means we have to create the opportunities for them to actually be able to do so. You don't get good at doing things that you don't do very often. If we want them to drive their own learning, we have to create those opportunities to do so. The third key message in all of this is that you must know thy impact. To quote John, know thy impact, that always as educators, we are thinking evaluatively. As teachers, as school leaders, and as students, we're always thinking evaluatively. What's working? What's not working? What might be getting in the way? And being able to examine what our impact is, that we're skilled at being able to assess and evaluate our own effectiveness so that we can make better decisions. Those better decisions that continuously improve the system itself. Remember, visible learning is about not only our students, but how it is that adults think about what it is they do. And then finally, that fourth key message is about collective responsibility. The collective responsibility for learning is on all of us collectively together. It's not just the responsibility of the single teacher who's got 30 students on their roster, for example. We're all responsible for the learning that happens in our school, in our district, and so on. There's a focus on skills, the skills that are needed for teachers and school leaders to really be able to ensure that we're as productive in our collaborations as possible. Not just the I skills, but the we skills. And also in collective responsibility, taking ownership, assuming responsibility for the learning of ourselves and the learning of others. Those four key messages hold the center for visible learning.
You know what I think of with those four key messages? And Nancy, I'm going to be completely honest here. I taught physics and chemistry and math. And in my little bubble, there was an answer. There may be different ways to solve a linear equation, and there might be different approaches to solving that parabolic motion problem, but you were going to arrive at an answer, and there were a list of prescribed ways to do it. Your problem may look slightly different, but for the most part, there were only so many lanes you could take to arrive at that answer. And so when we talk about our starting points with visible learning, I don't know if you and those of you on the other side of this screen can relate. It would be much easier if somebody could say to us, do this, do this, do this, do this, and bam, your learning will take off. We will have students that can drive their own learning. We'll have the climate we want. And that doesn't work, because I'm about to shift gears on you. Some of you may not think this is appropriate for an education webinar, but if you come out to Virginia, in particular Northern Virginia, the soil in Northern Virginia has a similar consistency to the soil in Napa Valley. And so we have lots of vineyards and breweries around here that often compete with the Napa Valleys. But our strength are white wines, not reds, because of the soil. And so we have to make adjustments to what we do over here, because we have different soil than Napa has when you get right down to the granular level. But in general, we have soil that's conducive to growing grapes. So all of us have soil in our schools and classrooms to produce learners. But when you get down to the granular level, it gets more complicated because the local context is different. And so when we think through this, we have to remember it's not a starting point. It's not the starting point. It's your starting point. And so what Nancy and I want to do is share with you an implementation model that will get us thinking about what your starting point would be. If you logged onto the webinar thinking we were going to give you the step-by-step process, hang tight. You're still going to have a blast, but it's going to be a little more difficult because you're going to have to think about your local context. So let's talk through a quick overview of the model. And then we'll pick it apart a little bit at a time and spend the remainder of our webinar time looking at very specific ways to use this model. One of the first things you have to do in your own world is figure out what goals are worth pursuing. In other words, what is it I'm after? And what problems do I need to address? Because that's going to tell you what your starting point is. And then what actions are you going to take? And the visible learning database is a great place to start because that's the potential interventions that give us a return on the investment. Then we're going to spend some time doing it. And we're going to talk about that shortly. Then we have to check and see if it worked and evaluate our impact. And then here's the cool one. Then we got to scale it up. How do we take what we did here and let that success and that culture of excellence move through our entire school, our entire district, and maybe even our entire region? And so, Nancy, you're going to walk us through that first part. What do we mean when we say discovering goals worth pursuing?
And that's so vital because we can choose to expend our energy doing things that are not important. None of us wants to be able to do that. So spending time with figuring out what your goals are going to be is going to be really essential. What is worth pursuing? What are the problems that are worth being able to address? And it probably is a bit of a tipping of the hand to be able to say that, and we've already said it, climate first. Climate first. We've got to pay attention to what the climate is in our classroom, in our schools. And there's an old saying that the last thing a fish notices is the water it swims in. Taking that opportunity to take a step back and to be able to look at the water that's around you, the environment, the climate that we're actually in, to be able to say, here are places that we think are strengths of ours. Here are places that we think need to be improved. That is an excellent entry point for being able to do so. But another worthy entry point and another place where you might have goals is about what makes a good learner in your classroom or school. Many schools have statements about dispositions and so on, but how is that actually evidenced? How does it move from things that we would like to have happen? Because remember, a wish is not a plan. But rather, how is it that that's actually being evidenced? Now, your entry points are going to be a bit different depending on what some of your answers are. And of course, you can't answer it all by yourself. You got to talk to other people. But some great questions to be able to think about include things like understanding, are there gaps? Are there gaps that we have between what it is that we desire to have as outcomes and what we're actually able to do? So we're looking closely. What has our impact been? Or in some cases, what's missing? What is actually absent from all of that? But the real question that we want to get to is especially this third one. And that is especially, where can we grow? So not only getting stuck on a deficit model, here are the things that are gaps, here are the things that are missing, but evolving that and taking it to that next level. Where can we grow?
And so once we have those areas of that are gaps that we need to close, what's missing and where can we grow? The next question is, okay, so then how do we close that gap, fill in that missing thing, whatever it happens to be, or how do we foster, nurture, and sustain that growth that we want? And so it brings us to that second part of the model. And this is where the visible learning database really has a rightful place in the conversation. Remember, it's not a list of our favorite strategies. It's not a top 25. It's not an NCAA coaches poll. It is a database of research. And so the question then is, what is it that I'm going to do to address those particular problems of practice, common challenges, whatever name you have for it in your own context? What are those things? And this is where the fun starts, because the Visible Learning Database helps us sort through those influences, strategies, approaches that have the highest potential for addressing the gap, the missing area, and promote that growth. And so it's one of the reasons why the thermometer of influence is so powerful, because there are things that heat it up and there are things that cool it down. And we want to make sure we heat up learning as much as we possibly can, as much as we possibly can. And so this is where we had a lot of fun thinking and trying to process, how do we make heads or tails out of 350 plus influences? How do we do that? And so we want to introduce you to the concept of signature practices. These are things that you would see and experience anytime you were in a school that was a visible learning school. These are things that you would see on a regular basis. And you're going to see some repetition here, but it's not because we try to be redundant, but it's because we want to show you how these things are integrated and fit together. Let me give you a quick example. When you walk into a visible learning school, you're going to feel it. Because there has been time, attention, and energy devoted to classroom and school climate that promotes a sense of belonging and an equity of access and opportunity to the highest level of learning possible for any student. And I'm going to call out health sciences for a second. We were there this summer, and it was the most amazing thing in the world, because I had my two children with me. And when we walked into the school, one of the first things that both Tessa and Jackson noticed were the mirrors on the wall that said, "You belong." And Tessa and Jackson both looked at them and they saw themselves. And then you go up the steps a little bit, and there's one that says, this is what a math person looks like. And it's another mirror. And this is what a writer looks like. And this is what a thinker looks like. And so there's this feeling that gosh, I really belong here, because attention has been devoted to that particular set of signature practices around classroom climate and school climate. Another tried and true, teacher clarity. Do the learners and do the teachers and do the leaders know the what, the why, and the how of learning? And so these are two signature practices that you would see and are excellent starting points based on the gap, the thing that's missing, or areas for growth. Now there's some more, so let's keep moving through a couple more. Nancy, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, as you decide what your entry point is, where is it that you want to go? In some cases, the signature practice that you may want to initially be really taking a close look at is around the phases of learning. And the phases of learning have certainly existed. They're not things that any of us invented along the way, but rather to really be able to understand that there is surface learning, there is deep learning, and there is transfer of learning. And in any kind of a learning practice, whether we're talking about the learning of adults or we're talking about the learning of our students, anytime that we think about learning, we have to think about what are those that surface learning that needs to happen. In other words, what are the knowledge that needs to be acquired in order to be able to have a place to move forward. That's called surface learning. And surface learning should not be misconstrued as being superficial learning. It's super important that you're able to acquire that basic information. But I think this is a place where some kinds of professional development get tripped up. It's a lot of emphasis on surface learning. Here are these things that you're going to be learning about today, but without moving to that next phase and understanding that that next phase is around deeper learning. In other words, how do we consolidate? As a learner, how do you consolidate what it is that you have been learning about and begin to integrate it into what it is that you already know, your experiences, and so on? That consolidation phase is really important. And guess what? The strategies that really support surface level learning do a really terrible job when it comes to fostering deeper levels of learning. So you've got to know, where are my learners at? And then to be able to select those kinds of learning opportunities that help to move them from surface levels of learning to deeper levels of learning. Now, transfer of learning is essential. In fact, I think most of us would argue that transfer of learning is the ultimate purpose of the learning that is happening in our classrooms. Can you utilize new information? Can you utilize information knowledge that you have acquired and consolidated and apply it into a new and novel situation? That's transfer of learning. Now, our time together today, because it's very short, is going to be a lot around surface levels of learning. We're introducing ideas to you as well. But this idea, and Casey nailed it as well, generalization, right? That if we're not moving to transfer and generalization, then why are we spending so much time teaching the things that we're teaching? So being knowledgeable about the phases of learning, whether we're working as school leaders with fellow teachers or we're working with our second graders, we've got to have a deep understanding of phases of learning. And that kind of links up and syncs up to a fourth practice, which we talked about a bit earlier, this idea of teaching students how to drive their own learning. If our instructional practices are only at that surface level of learning, or the majority of that surface level of learning, they don't get opportunities to drive their learning, to deepen their learning, to transfer their learning as well. So this signature practice really has a nice interwoven portion with that previous practice. We need to understand about the phases of learning, and we need to understand how it is that we teach students over time. We foster their ability to be able to increasingly drive their own learning.
And so if those four signature practices don't align with your gaps, areas of growth, or focal points, in other words, what goals are worth pursuing, another signature practice that is linked to visible learning is this idea of teaching with intent. Do we use a jigsaw just because it's fun? Do we use a think, pair, share just because I read about it? Or are we intentional in how we select and integrate strategies into our classrooms? Are we doing things like the model for gradual release of responsibility, where I'm going to do it, then we're going to do it, and then you all are going to do it, and then I'm going to hand it off to you as you transition into that driving of your own learning? So maybe one of the focal points, or one of the areas where you might direct your attention, is how do we help our classroom teachers and help ourselves become more intentional in what we're doing in the classroom? What does the progression look like from teacher-centered to student-driven? Now, the next one we're going to actually do rather than just talk about, because for me, one of the challenges I encountered is I didn't often allow my students to have opportunities for practice. I just did it. This is how you work the problem, and you're going to need to go figure it out. And so they were highly unstructured. I mean, I gave problems, I gave homework, but it wasn't purposeful and deliberate practice. It was just busy practice, or what researchers would call naive practice. I love that name. I love that they call it naive practice. They were just going through the motions. So let's practice here. You've been asked, to define visible learning, and then we've jumped in. And so we're at this midpoint here, kind of, sort of. So what is visible learning now? So let's practice. In the chat box, now how would you answer the question, what is visible learning? What would you do with that question now? Let's see if we've refined our thinking. Let's have some practice answering that question. What is it now to you? Yeah. You respond with learners instead of to them. Oh, Lisa, that's great. How we do what we do. I love that one. That's a bumper sticker. Intentionality, reflection. Right. Supporting students to drive their own. Yep. Students centered. Yep. Student evident in multiple situations. The tools they need to take learning as their own. Excellent. Ways in which teachers engage with learning to optimize their impact. Students owning their own learning. A mindful way of being, guiding, teaching, and applying. Yeah. Oh, students and teachers taking ownership. Interesting. That's a great way to purposeful learning. And so what's awesome is that we just made your thinking visible and you just made our teaching visible. And so what follows all of that, Nancy, is signature practice number 7, right? Which is
Feedback.
Yeah.
And I would say that if there's anything that is close to John Hattie's heart, it is feedback. And I always have his voice kind of echoing in my head about that as well. The first thing to know about feedback is that it goes in both directions. Feedback is not something that we do to students. When we're engaged in visible learning, we may be providing feedback, but then we are watching, listening closely to see what is the impact of that feedback. Did it land? Did it not land? Did it prompt new questions? Is it prompting questions in me? For example, am I getting the same questions all the time from my students? That's feedback to me that maybe I need to change my approach a little bit. Some of you that teach at the secondary level and teach multiple periods a day, you know that your third period class is not being taught in exactly the same way as your first period class was. Even if it is the same overall lesson plan, you learned about what was working, what was not working in that first period class, and you made adjustments along the way. That's feedback, and that's feedback to you about what the potential impact is. Now, that's a small example, and I think that it is something that perhaps many of us do without necessarily recognizing. How you think about what it is that you're doing is an essential part of that feedback. And then, of course, making sure that when we are offering feedback to students, that we're also understanding what are some of those proven techniques that help to increase the likelihood that that feedback is going to be effective. Having it paired closely with the event itself is really important because feedback gets stale really quickly. But also, too, using feedback for cues and reinforcements helps to be able to make the impact of feedback increase that much more. And I want to keep bringing this back to the adults because visible learning is not just what we do to kids, right? Visible learning is about how it is that we think, not just how our students think, how we think. And building collective efficacy is off the charts in terms of those influences. John, is John Hattie up to like, it's over 300 different influences, right?
It is. In fact, last count, we're at about, I think if I get it, about 350. But some of that is because like feedback, which we just talked about, is broken down into 6 different influences based on specifics. So yeah, it's over 300.
Yeah. Amazing, isn't it? And
Yes.
and so you take all these different influences and as John said, you don't just lop off the top 10 and go, "Oh, hey, that's where we should be putting all of our energy." But I am going to say this. Number 1, the number 1 influence that has the potential to accelerate student learning is the collective efficacy of the educators in that building. And it's more than just rah, rah, go team kinds of things, but when you've got teams with high levels of collective efficacy, those people know what their impact is. They know that they possess the wherewithal to be able to positively impact student learning because they look carefully at what it is that's working. They know what their impact is. That collective efficacy, off the charts. You want to increase your students' learning and achievement? Foster collective efficacy among the teams of adults in your school. Another one of those signature practices is around leading the learning. How is it that as school leaders, for example, that we lead the learning that happens at our school site? How do we learn as well what it is that happens at our schools as well? Leading adults in terms of that learning, leading our students in terms of that learning. And John, you've got just a couple more signature practices that we can begin to bring this on home.
That's right. This is a great starting point. Nancy, one of the things that I experience when I'm so blessed to be invited into so many different schools, and the pockets of excellence are there, and it's awesome. It's fun. I get excited. I take things back to my own classroom, because one of the signature practices that might be a starting point for you is, look, we have the tools. We have these outstanding teachers. We have great ideas, but maybe we need additional thinking around implementation. How do we take it from idea to integration? And so a signature practice linked to visible learning moves away from lists of strategies or particular approaches to teaching, and instead, how do I implement this into the context that I'm in right now, based on who my learners are? And so implementation may be a great starting point. How do we implement well those things that we know have the potential to have an impact? We just can't seem to get there yet. And so this signature practice may be a starting point for you. How do we implement what we do to begin with? What are some things that we can think about that can help improve our impact just by thinking about how we're doing the business of teaching and learning each and every day? The last one is a relatively new one on the scene in terms of the visible learning work, but not necessarily new to the research world. It's this concept of evaluative thinking. It's a way of approaching what we do evaluatively. In other words, what am I doing? What evidence do I have that what I'm doing is working? What am I going to do next? And what evidence told me that's what I'm going to do next? It gets us this type of thinking, but here's the catch. It's very different from reflection and critical thinking, because I can be reflective and I can think critically and do nothing with it. Evaluative thinking demands that we take action, And so when we think about this model, the 5 Ds that we've walked through, where might you pick your intervention to address those gaps? The signature practices are a great place to start, and that's the database, and that's where we go back to that database. But Nancy and I are not done yet, because once we make that selection, the next part of that model is all about this delivery. How do we deliver this or put this into place? Let's say I pick clarity as my starting point, or maybe I am going to focus on climate. Or maybe we've decided, look, we need to really think about our students having opportunities to practice and overlearn those things. Or maybe, as Nancy pointed out, maybe you've reflected on your information like, wow, we ask our students to go into transfer, but we don't spend a lot of time making sure that they have the surface learning in place to transfer. Or maybe we dive into to surface learning, but we never make it to transfer. And so maybe your starting point is the phases element of this, and how to foster, nurture, and sustain deeper learning. Well, you still got to put it into place. So how is it that we address the delivery aspect? Here's the question I often ask my students. How many of you, by reactions, use your emotional reactions on this one? You've got this great idea and you've read that it's high quality research, for example, the jigsaw, but when you go to do the jigsaw on Tuesday, you can't tell the difference between your classroom and the fight scene in the bar in a Western movie. Yeah, and those reactions are great. So, and my point being is, does it mean the jigsaw's bad? Well, no, the jigsaw is a tried and true method. It might be that my delivery was off. And so I think evaluatively, well, what could be wrong? Well, number one, did the jigsaw task align with my learning intentions and success criteria? Did the think, pair, share really need to be there? Did this really align to what I wanted out of the task? Number two, did I use the right dosage? Was it too long? Was it too short? Did I not build up to the jigsaw task? Did I not even give them a chance to get settled? We do this all the time. Well, I tried that on Tuesday and it didn't work, so I quit. Well, yeah, but you just did it on Tuesday. So what's the dosage? This is my favorite, Nancy. What if I do a jigsaw and I give students text and tasks that are not appropriate for their current learning needs? So it's really not the jigsaw that didn't work. It's that I gave kindergartners a John Donne poem and had them analyze it. Well, my gosh, I'm 21 years old and I can't analyze a John Donne poem. I'm gonna let that land on anyone that's paying attention at this point. So the point being is, did you adapt it for who the audience was? Did you put the who before the do? Thank you, Anna, for responding. Last and certainly not least, Nancy, I think we've mentioned this at least 5 or 6 times tonight. If the soil, the climate isn't there, then the delivery is going to fall flat. If students aren't psychologically safe, a jigsaw is going to be out of the question. If students do not feel they can operate in a cohesive classroom, the jigsaw is going to fall flat. We're not done. Once I deliver it, Nancy,
then I have to double back and monitor progress and evaluate what that impact is. We can't just do things and hope for the best. What we have to do is we have to use assessment in ways that are informative. And there are a couple of different ways that we end up using assessment in informative kinds of ways. And what they include is planning for the evaluation. I hear, John, I hear this term all the time. I'm sure you do as well. Data-driven decision making. Now, I do think it's a good idea to make decisions based on the data that you have, but you've got to close the loop on that. What's your plan for evaluation of it? Where is the decision-driven data? Once you make a decision, we're going to do this, or we're going to buy this, or whatever, then you need to collect the data to be able to figure out what is working, what is not working. Planning for an evaluation, not just making a decision. The second is interpreting the evidence that has been gathered. I have a family member who has high blood pressure. And I would have been very unhappy if the doctor had said, okay, well, you have high blood pressure, so here's a medication, and I'll see you in a year. No, we've got to be able not only to collect that information, planning for evaluation. I want to see you back here in 6 weeks, and I want you to keep a log of your blood pressure that you're taking at home every day. But then when you go back in 6 weeks and you've got that log, now what the physician is going to do is with you begin to interpret the evidence that has been gathered. In other words, we collect the data to see, was the decision right? Is the dosage correct? Is it need to be another medication? And if those decisions are, yeah, this doesn't seem to be working right, we utilize that evidence then to make a new set of decisions. Yep, you need a different dosage, or you need a different medication altogether. And what that allows for is an increased acuity at the decisions that you've made, not just doing, but having evidence, interpreting that evidence, collecting that evidence so that you know what it is to happen that needs to happen next. Is this effective? Is it effective in certain situations? What is it that I can do to continually improve that? And John, I know, bringing it on home, what's the last part of that model?
The last part of this model is scaling it up, and how do we enhance and sustain? Now, I want to zero in the last couple of minutes we have together, because one of the things that Nancy and I will often talk about, sometimes informally, sometimes formally, it comes up. How do we do this in a way that's sustainable? Because at the end of the day, the demands and the expectations and the high complexity of the teaching and learning environment, it really means we can't be doing things just for the sake of doing them. We have to think about it in terms of the sustainability of this. So when you talk about your starting point, when you identify that starting point, when you decide where you want to go, we have to be looking long term to say, is this sustainable with the human beings that are in the building and dedicate their time, energy, work, and lives to this, to what's happening? How do we make sure that teacher morale, that we don't run into burnout situations? What do we do? I heard my family loves Pink. If Pink sings it, if Pink does it, we watch it, we go see it, we listen to it. And she has this verse in one of her songs that says, "We burn so bright, we burn out." And I love that verse. Now, I can't tell you the rest of the verses around that song because it is not appropriate and has nothing to do with Napa Valley. But my point being is that is exactly what we're talking about. And so while you may have expected something different for this last part of the model, Nancy and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about sustainability. Your starting point has to be picking something that's sustainable. And so Janet Clinton often talks about this in terms of the 4 C's. What is the capacity of me or my team? What are we capable of doing now, and where will we need additional professional learning? Where will we need additional support to either build capacity to do this or to enhance our capability to do this effectively? Do we have access to that? Complexity. What's the complexity of our environment? What's the complexity of the change? Is it going to require us to redo the entire thing from top to bottom? And do we have the capability and capacity to do that? What's the complexity of the idea here? What am I going to have to do? If it requires redoing our entire literacy program, can we do that? Or changing our entire teacher evaluation system, can we do that? Or is it adjusting our master schedule? There's different levels of complexity based on what you want to do and how you want to start this off. Last and certainly not least is compatibility. To tip my hat to the hurricane that is currently en route. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, but sometimes our ideas are not compatible with our current setting. We can't change national policy tomorrow. We can't change state policies tomorrow. We can't change state laws. So your starting point can't be, I want to get rid of the Virginia Literacy Act. That's not compatible to what we're doing. your starting point needs to be reflective of the capacity and capability right now, knowing that we can grow that through professional learning, but also acknowledging the complexity and the compatibility with where we are at this moment. How do we make sure this is sustainable? And so how sustainable is this in your school or classroom? How sustainable is it? That's going to also dictate your starting point. Maybe not my starting point and maybe not your neighbor's, but starting point. All right, Nancy, how'd we do?
Well, I think only our learners can actually make that claim, but our intentions around this were especially to introduce you to 4 key messages and how it is that they hold the center of what we do. And John and I quickly introduced those 11 signature practices that that can be found within the visible learning work. In other words, pulling those many influences together and putting them into 11 buckets, if you will. And finally, hopefully being able to contribute to you and being able to identify what's a potential starting point for our visible learning journey. And with that, I'd love to turn this over to Megan because Megan has prizes.
Thank you for all the learning, for all your questions, for all your interactions. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week and stay safe and stay well. Thank you, everyone.